Hello everyone, it's Akunna from Grainlux and welcome to another episode of Toolkit Tuesday, where we provide you with the tools to empower you to live a life that is fulfilling and impactful. So last week I spoke about courage and how it is a habit, that we can grow in it and develop it through everyday acts of courage. In other words, it doesn't always have to be these big heroic acts. It can be practiced in the everyday humdrum of life. And so what is important is to practice it, because the more often you practice it, the stronger it gets. Now, it can't come as a surprise to you that there is another tool that goes hand in hand with courage. And I briefly mentioned it in last week's episode, so are you listening? Can you remember what it was? Well, if you guessed vulnerability, then you're spot on. The next tool to empower you to live a life that is fulfilling and impactful is this. Practice vulnerability. Yes, learn to be vulnerable. I know for many of us, the thought of being vulnerable conjures up feelings of fear and worry. Your body might tense up at the idea of being vulnerable. And that's because we've been conditioned to think that vulnerability equates to being weak. We don't want to be seen in a way that leaves us feeling exposed. And so we would rather protect ourselves by not being vulnerable. And so with that narrative playing in our head, we tend to be more fearful, less trusting of the world around us, and as such become disconnected. But thanks to Dr. Brené Brown and other researchers, we've come to understand the need that is vulnerability in order to live a full life, to be innovative and creative. Through her study of vulnerability and shame over the years, she shows us that, and I quote, vulnerability is the core, the heart, the center of meaningful human experiences. And so since we know this, what often gets in the way of us engaging with this tool more often? Well, for one, we know that it requires courage. The courage to step out authentically, even in the midst of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. I'm sure we've all at some point or another experienced this, when we've had to put ourselves out there, whether it's to our spouse, a friend, or a colleague at work. And in doing so, we experience a real sense of fear, and we begin to play the what-if game in our heads. You know the tape that says, well, how would they think of me now? Will I be rejected? How can I be so stupid? I mean, the list is endless. And yet we also know the feeling we get when we've showed up authentically and been vulnerable. There's a sense of freedom that it brings. For some of us, we might have experienced empathy, for example. For others, it helped us become more resilient and braver, and also fostered better connections and relationships with others. And so we know the strength that is vulnerability. Now, does that mean that one is vulnerable for vulnerability's sake? Far from it. Also, does it mean that how we all have the same way of being vulnerable? Not at all. At the core of it all, it's this. How am I choosing to be my authentic self in situations when I don't know the outcome? In other words, what is the emotional risk that I'm willing to take in order to show up authentically? So for example, sharing your hopes and dreams might not feel vulnerable to you, but it may very well be for someone else. In addition, oversharing is not necessarily being vulnerable. Yes, being vulnerable requires us to share our true selves. However, sharing doesn't always mean an active dump of personal insight, feelings, etc. I think we sometimes think that being vulnerable is telling every Tom, Dick, or Harry how we feel and that we need to cry in order to be vulnerable. Also not true. The test Brené Brown offers is this. Firstly, be aware of your armor. We all have armors we wear, and we often suit it up in moments of vulnerability. And so the invitation is this. When there is uncertainty or a feeling of emotional exposure or risk, instead of armoring up, lean in, be brave, stay in the discomfort. That's what vulnerability is. And to be honest, over the past 9 weeks, I have been reminded of this very ask every Tuesday when I've had to post an episode of Toolkit Tuesday. For me, there's emotional exposure with sharing my thoughts and opinions each episode. There's uncertainty on whether or not my intention and hopes for an episode is received accordingly. And there's also a risk of offending someone or being rejected. And so, at least on a weekly basis, I am called to practice courage and vulnerability every time I share a Toolkit Tuesday episode with you all. And to be honest, it hasn't been easy heeding that call, but I lean in and stay with the discomfort. Well, now that we understand what vulnerability is and isn't, How can you begin to practice it? During my research for this episode, I came across an article that proposes 3 questions to ask yourself in a given situation on when to be vulnerable. Firstly, do I want to reveal my true self in this situation? Because real vulnerability is when you want to reveal that authentic self to the world. Secondly, what am I hoping to gain from this act? It's crucial to check your motives before attempting vulnerability. If you're hoping to gain trust, closeness, and a deeper appreciation for authenticity, you're on the right track. And finally, what is the most vulnerable thing to do in this situation? At the base of it all, real vulnerability is showing up. It's choosing to say, this is who I am, how I feel, and what I want. And there you have it. 3 simple questions to get you started. Vulnerability may not be the most comfortable nor natural way to live, but it allows for creativity, innovation, and authentic connection with others, which in turn allows you to fully engage with the world around you in an authentic way. If you want to know more about this incredible yet important tool, check out Brené Brown's TED Talk entitled The Power of Vulnerability, or you can also read her book, Daring Greatly. As always, I'd love to hear from you. What does vulnerability look like for you? How did you practice being vulnerable today? And how did being vulnerable aid you in living a fulfilling and impactful life? As always, please leave your comments and questions in the comment section below, or send it to us at info@greatlocks.com. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Toolkit Tuesday. Remember, you are worthy of a life that is fulfilling and impactful. And so, be who you are and be that well. Until next time, take care. Ciao!